Political leaders don't like being dragged to inquiries. Their status for a few hours lowered. Their news grids for months at the mercy of what is dug up. But today, the Prime Minister bowed to the inevitable when he was asked to commit to an inquiry on COVID-19.
If he still rejects an immediate inquiry, will he instead commit, in principle, to a future public inquiry? Yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've told the House several times, I do not believe that now, in the middle of combating, still as we are, a pandemic, is the right moment to devote huge amounts of official time to an inquiry. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we will seek to learn the lessons of this pandemic in the future. And certainly we will have an independent inquiry into what happened.
The inquiry would look into issues like the management of test and trace. The Labour leader asked the Prime Minister about a government-commissioned report on preparations for a second wave of COVID-19 and whether test and trace was ready to cope.
Actually, they are doing fantastic work. 70% or 80% of the contacts are found, and they are getting through to the vast majority of people who have the disease. And I can certainly give the House the assurance that our test and trace system is as good as or better than any other system anywhere in the world.
The problem with the Prime Minister quoting the 70% of people who are contacted and asked to self-isolate is that's gone down. It was 90% just a few weeks ago, and every week it's gone down. So I wouldn't quote the latest figure, looking at the trend. But I have to ask, in light of the last few questions, has the Prime Minister actually read this report that sets out the reasonable worst-case scenario and tells the government what it needs to do about it in the next 6 weeks? Has he read it?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'm of course aware of the report, and we're
not quite the same thing as having read it, Labour MPs jeered. A future inquiry would also look into government messaging on public health, which the government was struggling with today on the issue of where would face coverings be compulsory. In a sandwich shop, for instance.
From the 24th of July, do you need to wear a face mask coming out of Pret?
You do need to wear a face mask in Pret because Pret is a shop.
A Number 10 spokesman later said masks would not be mandatory in a sandwich takeaway cafe like Pret.
I don't think it has to take a long time. Having been told by a cabinet secretary that mine would take a year and a half.
Lawrence Freedman served on the Iraq inquiry for nearly 7 years. From your experience of being on an inquiry yourself, having looked at the evidence on COVID-19, where will this be in the scale of damning reports?
No, I think we're talking about something different from the Savile inquiry on Bloody Sunday or Iraq, because the government didn't choose for there to be a pandemic. I mean, it's not to say that there's not going to be some damning criticism. I'm sure there will be along the way.
The Prime Minister was pressed for another shift in public health messaging today, trying to get workers, including civil servants, back into empty offices. Some Tory MPs hope for movement on that soon.
Well, some breaking news from Westminster now. The former Cabinet Minister Chris Grayling has failed to win a vote to chair an influential Commons committee, despite being Boris Johnson's choice for the role. Let's get more from Gary now. Gary, what's the significance of this?
Well, he wasn't just Boris Johnson's choice. Boris Johnson thought he'd stitch this whole thing up. Number 10 had changed the composition of the committee to make sure that the Tories were in a majority, and assumed that meant that their man, Chris Grayling, the man Boris Johnson relieved of cabinet office when he came into power, but nonetheless part of the sort of vote leave gang, would get his consolation prize, the chairmanship of this committee, and probably some MPs think be a rather acquiescent and useful chairman as far as the government was concerned. They hadn't counted on one of those MPs, Julian Lewis, necessarily. They hadn't really sounded him out, from what I can hear, to check that he would take the line. And it would appear that Julian Lewis stitched up a deal with the opposition MPs on this committee and decided to make himself the candidate, rather exquisitely, in a sort of House of Cards way. The first that Chris Grayling knew of this, I gather, is when he turned over the ballot paper and saw, to his surprise, a fellow Tory MP's name on it. In that moment, I suspect the truth sank in. There are the wider significance of all of this is not just whether Julian Lewis, who's been a bit of an awkward customer for the government as chairman of the Defence Select Committee, was an ardent supporter of John Bercow, not exactly flavour of the months with an awful lot of Tory MPs, most months when he was Speaker. It could have implications for the way intelligence is scrutinised, but I think a lot of MPs think it's also a shot across the government's bows. They might have a 80-plus majority, but that doesn't mean they're going to get everything their own way in this Parliament. That's the signal a lot of MPs hope that this sends, because they feel that Number 10 is pretty high-handed, sometimes contemptuous of MPs.
The plot thickens. Gary, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to Tobias Elwood, who chairs the Defence Select Committee, and I began by asking him if he was happy that the Prime Minister had acknowledged that there would be an independent inquiry.
I welcome the call for an independent inquiry and the agreement by the Prime Minister, but absolutely it needs to happen immediately. Let's have an interim report so we can learn the lessons. Unlike a flood or a terrorist attack, an acute event that we respond to, this is an enduring emergency. And until we find a vaccine, then we're having to continue to live with this new normal. We need to learn from our experiences, from the mistakes we make, and also from the things that we're doing right. So I don't want to see any delay in us understanding how we can better ourselves as we venture towards this vaccine. But until then, having to adapt to this new normal.
Isn't it legitimate for Downing Street to say that they're dealing every day with the enormity of this crisis? They simply haven't got time to submit to an independent inquiry.
Well, much as I want to support this government, no government in history is very good at self-reflection. You know, we need to understand what has worked well, the incredible effort of the NHS, for example, the volunteers coming out. The economic package Vinci mentioned has been fantastic. The armed forces, of course, I'm going to support them and their Nightingale projects and others. But there's other things that we could do better as well. I touched on the fact that this is an enduring emergency, but we still have a peacetime cabinet construct making the decisions. There isn't a difference between what you've got to do with policy proposal and operational delivery. And then, of course, we've got the issues to do with stockpiling of PPE, the global competition that we face. We've got the protection in the care homes, and, of course, the importance of ratcheting up that testing. So looking ahead, we've got further lockdowns that we need to anticipate for, preparation for a second wave, and, of course, further erosion of GDP. These are big things for us to consider, get our heads around now.
Is it time to bring other parties and other decision makers into government? You were talking about a peacetime construct of government at the moment. Is it time to put it on a sort of war footing, really?
Well, I wanted to see a war footing. I wanted to see swifter, more informed decision-making, clarity of communications, good, strong command and control. And I'm afraid that is the piece that's actually missing here. We need a situation centre which actually has full operational awareness of what's going on in the country, so we can close things down very, very fast indeed. Those 5 p.m. briefings, for example, were critical to allow everybody to keep up to date. And yes, it should include contributions from other parties as well. Absolutely, you're not going to be able to take full stock of this until the pandemic is over, but we could come out with interim reports so we can learn on the go.
Just on another matter, we've just heard tonight that Chris Grayling, who Number 10 was quite keen to see installed at the head of the Intelligence and Security Committee, has been outmanoeuvred by a fellow Conservative backbencher, Julian Lewis. What does that say, do you think, about the power of Number 10 over backbenchers?
Well, it's interesting to see that the role has finally been filled. That's my concern. It had been absent for some time. We have this elusive Russia report, which I want to read, I want to understand, and I want to see what the government's going to say. As a fellow chair of another select committee, I'm just glad the role is filled. I hope that we can continue holding this government to account, but also recognising that the Intelligence and Security Committee forms an important function of holding our agencies to account as well.
Tobias Elwood, thanks very much.
Tough choices lie ahead, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has warned, as the economy continues to count the cost of the coronavirus pandemic. But he wouldn't reveal which taxes would have to go up or whether there would be spending cuts, despite Boris Johnson's promise of no more austerity. Among the major job cuts announced today, up to 573 jobs will go at Buzz Bingo, as the impact of the lockdown means it is closing 26 of its clubs. 520 posts are being axed at the BBC, and 180 jobs will go at The Guardian. While £4.1 billion in VAT cuts came into force across the hospitality sector, which has been especially hard hit by the crisis. Here's our business and global trade correspondent, Paul McNamara.
We've been full on the terrace most days. Obviously, when it rains, it's a bit tricky for us, but you know, the sun has been kind to us, so we're very thankful.
For the last 10 days, business here has been good. It needs to, because for the 3 months before that, it was non-existent. Today, this bar and restaurant in South London and thousands more like it across the nation were given another bunk to boost the balance sheet. The slashing of VAT from 20 to 5%. For some, it's a sweetener for the customers. For others, it's nourishment for starved accounts. Are you passing that on to your customers?
We're going to be using all of that money to reinvest back into our staff and our people and our offering.
How important then is that saving to you?
Critical. We're in survival mode right now. Really, everything comes down to the pennies and the coins that we can, pull together to ensure that we can continue to operate as a restaurant.
Many established high street giants have promised to pass on savings to customers, such as KFC, Nando's and Pret a Manger. The tax cut will be in place until January and could save households £160 a year, according to the Treasury. One man who took advantage today was the Chancellor, buying a sandwich before facing MPs at a virtual select committee and defending the choice of business to pass on cuts or not.
Whether the benefit slightly flows to consumers or to the businesses, it's some mix of that. All of that is helpful for safeguarding jobs. And that's what this is about.
This one stimulus package alone will cost around £4 billion, on top of the cost of the furlough scheme and grants and loans to businesses. The Chancellor was asked repeatedly how he is planning to balance the books, tax rises or austerity. One or other appears to be on the way.
In terms of, what does that mean for spending and taxes? Those are decisions that have to wait until we get to budgets. But look, there are tough choices ahead.
Another line he was repeatedly pushed on: many may have received help. What about those fallen between the gaps?
Can you honestly tell us today that you're satisfied that you've done the best you can to support those whose livelihoods have been affected?
I know there will be people out there who feel that they have not got help in the exact way that they would have liked to. I completely understand that. I sympathise with them and indeed I apologise for it.
As Rishi Sunak faced MPs, more than 1,000 people were told they faced unemployment. 573 job losses announced at Buzz Bingo, 520 at the BBC, just the latest to be added to the thousands lost across the economy in the last month. While many jobs and businesses have been saved by government actions so far, the heat is still on. Are you guaranteed now that you'll be fine?
We are not guaranteed. I don't think any hospitality business can be guaranteed. We're still fighting for survival.
At the end of this month, the furlough scheme starts to wind up. The lifelines start being cut. We find out who stays afloat and who falls.
Well, the tech giant Apple has seen an EU Commission ruling over a €13 billion tax bill overturned by an EU court in Luxembourg. Paul McNamara joins us now live from the newsroom. Paul.
Yeah, quite a surreal turn there. You've got Rishi Sunak desperate not to be drawn on taxes, and across the Irish Sea we've got the Irish government apparently over the moon at being told they're not going to receive £11.5 billion in back taxes from Apple. Now that might sound counterintuitive, but ultimately it's because it makes Ireland still look like an attractive place to do business. So in 2016, the EU ruled that Apple had been given illegal tax breaks by Dublin. Apple appealed this, today they won. Apple said this case was not about how much tax we pay, but where we're required to pay it. We're proud to be the largest taxpayer in the world, and as we know, the important role tax payments play in society. So Ireland isn't going to get £11.5 billion. The government seem happy about it. You can bet your bottom dollar, or £11.5 billion bottom dollars, that the people paying the keenest interest to this will be tax specialists at other tech giants.
Paul, thanks very much. Now, new measures have been imposed in Blackburn with Darwen after the area's public health chief warned it was facing a rising tide of coronavirus cases. For the next month, residents are being told to wear face coverings in all public spaces, including workplaces, along with stricter limits on the number of people who can visit a different household. It's an effort to bring the cases under control and avoid a local lockdown, as our Home Affairs correspondent Darshna Soni reports.
It's wedding season. And Tabs Afzal specialises in Asian bridal wear. It's usually her busiest time, but not this year.
We've had some groomzilla and bridezilla moments as well, unfortunately, due to the fact that weddings unfortunately cannot happen to the scale that they want.
No big fat Asian weddings?
No, it has been disheartening for a lot of brides and grooms. Believe it or not, men are quite sensitive as well, that they can't have the big day that they wanted. So a lot have postponed, which has impacted us as a business.
Just as Ms Afzal was getting ready to celebrate the lifting of lockdown, Blackburn now faces the prospect of having restrictions reimposed. New figures show that the former mill town is currently the 4th worst affected local authority, with a positive test rate of 7% compared to a national average of 2.5%. At this community centre, they told me they're recording public service messages in a variety of languages after the data revealed that of 114 confirmed cases in the last fortnight, 97 were from the South Asian community. They're urging residents to abide by new guidelines brought in by Blackburn and Darwen Council. These include wearing face coverings in all public spaces and only allowing 2 members of one household to visit another household. But as with other local authorities, they say getting the data has been difficult.
Have you had the data that you need quickly enough from government, showing things like ethnicity, postcode, occupation?
It's still an issue. Data is really important for us because we need to work really, really closely with the latest data available to us. It gives us the eyes and ears to be able to take action. Data has been a problem, certainly in terms of a time lag.
Health officials say that in the last 2 weeks, 85% of positive test results have been from within the South Asian community.
So why has this community here in particular seen so many positive results? One theory that public health officials are investigating is that younger residents of working age here may be asymptomatically infected and then carrying the disease back to their multi-generational families.
I didn't get the classic sore throat, I did have a temperature, but I didn't have a sore throat.
But for Jamila Mullah, it's too easy to fall back on stereotypes about her community. She has had COVID-19, yet doesn't live in an extended family. She's been working from home since March, only going out to visit the supermarket.
It's saying that Blackburn's harder hit because we've got the terrace houses, we've got kind of the 3 generational families living together, and I think that's a lot. I think it does still happen in some houses, but in the main it doesn't. So I think there's a lot of stereotype around that. Like this area, Plegate, Beardwood, is predominantly a lot of Asians, and it's just one family.
In Leicester, a city where more than 50% of residents are from a minority ethnic background, a similar pattern was reported amongst its Asian communities. Its residents will find out tomorrow if their lockdown is to end. The authorities in Blackburn say they want to avoid having similar restrictions imposed by the government in Westminster, especially with Eid coming up at the end of July. And so they're asking all residents to stick to their new guidelines. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Blackburn.